I think we're ready to move into our next session, which is going to be a panel discussion on educating children in vulnerable communities. For this session, I'm going to be moderating, and I am very fortunate and very happy to have joining me Dr. Dexter De Silva, Professor of Educational Psychology at KSAN University, and also Dr. Raz Speiser, lecturer and pedagogical instructor at Kai Academic College of Education in Israel. We also had intended to have with us Moniba Mahmood, who is a doctoral student in the UK at the moment, and has done some work particularly on issues relating to education for women and girls in under Taliban controlled areas. So we certainly wish she could have been here to join us, but her schedule wouldn't allow it. So we will look forward to having her at a future conference. But we do have Dr. Dexter De Silva and Dr. Raz Speiser, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from them in just a moment. And I'll let them introduce themselves in a little more detail. Just to start us out, I wanted to introduce our topic. I think we have some slides. If we can get those up, I'll try to share just a couple of slides as a way of introducing the topic of the panel. So as we said, this is a panel on educating children in vulnerable communities. This had originally started as an idea. My background is in refugee protection and international law related to refugee and human rights. And I was very much interested in the importance of education for those people who are displaced, but also the challenges that we face in trying to provide education for people in those communities. And in talking to our fellow panelists, particularly Raz brought up that, you know, a lot of challenges may be common for other vulnerable groups and not just refugees. And so we decided to broaden the topic a little bit to include vulnerable communities more generally as opposed to refugees specifically. So if we can see the next slide. So as I said, we have, there's three of us here discussing today. I'll kind of be moderating the topic, and Drs. Speiser and De Silva will be providing their perspectives and expertise from their respective fields. And just to give you an idea of kind of the format of this panel is, again, I'm going to introduce a little bit about the topic as I am now, and then hand it over to first to Dr. De Silva and then to Dr. Speiser to talk about their perspectives and to provide their insights, as well as to introduce themselves maybe in a little more detail than I have. And then I'll have some questions directed to them, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. Okay, so the challenges. We're looking at this in a couple of different ways. You know, first of all, we're going to talk about who are the vulnerable communities. And then we're going to talk about what are the common challenges that we face in providing education or that they face in accessing education. And how do we address these issues? What's being done now, and what ideas do we have that we may be able to implement going forward? So a few different kind of angles from which to approach this topic. Okay. So just to kind of lay the foundation for the discussion, who are the vulnerable children? Who are we talking about when we discuss this topic? So as I've already mentioned, refugees, an estimated 50 million displaced people in the world, and roughly 5 million of those are thought to be outside of formal education structures at this point. That's an awful lot of children who are not getting the education that they so badly need. Slavery is another big issue that sometimes people overlook. Displacement, in the case of refugees and other displaced people, certainly challenges young people, challenges our ability to provide education to them. But slavery also does, and any kind of child labor. But unfortunately, we still have a large number of children actually in forced labor. And those are issues, those are vulnerable groups that we certainly need to consider. As I mentioned, one of our panelists who couldn't be with us has been working particularly on the issue of education for girls in certain environments, in certain societies where they are not given the same access to education as others. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here, but we still want to recognize that that is an important vulnerable group in certain parts of the world, and we need to include them in this discussion. And disenfranchised populations, and this may be a bit of a catch-all. This is certainly a broad term. I use that to refer to any community in which people are somehow disenfranchised or disadvantaged by the social structures in which they reside. The one example that I used, and Raz can certainly speak to this more than I can, this is much more in his wheelhouse, if you will. But a 2018 OECD report found a really dramatic difference, for example, in Arabic-speaking students and Hebrew-speaking students within Israel. So in that sense, I think that we could say that that is a disenfranchised population. They are not receiving the same level of education, perhaps, that their counterparts are. So that's a group that we need to consider. Again, these are just examples. There are certainly issues of gender and of gender and of displacement and of disenfranchisement all over the world in different communities. So those are the kinds of vulnerable communities that we want to talk about today. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Dexter De Silva. Again, he's a professor of educational psychology at Keisen University in Tokyo. Dexter, it's very good to have you here. And if I could ask you just to briefly introduce yourself and to maybe provide some opening remarks on the topic and your thoughts on the subject.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this, Brian. And I love the topic. I love the theme. I love being involved in this group, the conference group. And my first remote conference experience, it's fun. First, about myself, I live in Japan now. I've lived here for about 30 years. My area, as you said, is educational psychology. That's what I've done my PhD in and most of my research about, and some of my teaching. But I was brought up mainly in Australia. So I'm Australian. I've lived there from junior high school to mid-20s. And then before that, I was born in the Caribbean, Trinidad. And so I've experienced different sort of educational systems and different kind of contexts, and I've seen different kinds of vulnerable communities in those things. So I love this theme. At Keisen, my university is Keisen. It's a women's university, Christian women's university. So I thought I'd just mention that as our sort of girls vulnerable group speaker is not here. Keisen in early 1920s or so started for girls in Japan who didn't have opportunities for education. It's as a school, junior high school. It's developed into a university and a graduate school for young women, older women, to empower them. So their access to education is strong enough, but it doesn't really guarantee them enough kind of power in society as well. So it still is trying to address that vulnerable community in Japan, young women. Addressing the topic as well, as I said, I love this topic. I think education and educational psychology in general in the past, when it looks at development, it has focused mainly on cognitive development or intellectual development. But in the last 20, 30 years, there's more recognition that social and emotional development are as important or maybe even more important. And so there's the move to kind of address that lack or that lack of recognition of the importance of a movement called social-emotional learning. And that's kind of what I think I can talk more about later on with the specific questions. What exactly that means and how it can be. Of course, it needs to be applied in different ways depending on the local context and the cultural context. These communities all have their own kind of difficulties or processes. So that's my sort of opening address to the panel. Thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. And now, if I can ask Dr. Speiser to also introduce himself and a little bit about his perspective on this topic.
Hi, again, thank you for inviting me. First, I introduce myself. I'm coming for the philosophy discipline. Started to teach education 11 years ago. I'm interested in critical thinking, project-based learning, multiculturalism, and also the personal perspective. It's important for me to be noted. I'm living here in the city of Beersheba, in the south of Israel, which is an area with both Jewish and Arab, mostly Bedouin population. Both the college I'm teaching in and is basically multicultural, at least in its population. I don't know how much in its attitude. And I'm part of a bilingual and bicultural community in Beersheba, which is called the Hagar, which has both schools and kindergartens. My girls, my daughters are studying there. And this gives me you might say, an inside perspective about the subject, which is more subjective, but it lets me also know the insight. So I try to combine the research and the subjective perspective on the subject. I'll read a few things that I wrote just for the introduction because it's important to me to bring them forth, and then I'll speak freely with your permission. So I want to say that in Israel, regarding Israel, I see three main types of vulnerable communities or disadvantaged communities. There are the poor people, of course, and there are quite many.
Sorry, Raz, I couldn't quite hear that. You're kind of drifting out a little bit.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you. What I said that in Israel, I see mainly three types of vulnerable communities. The first is the poor people. There is quite many poor people in Israel. Then there are the foreign workers, and then there is the Arab Israelis or the Palestinians in Israel, which are about 20% of the Israeli population. You didn't mention, Brian, in your introduction also the disabled people. I won't be talking about them here because their situation in Israel is quite different. I would say that they are more being taken of other communities.
Sorry, Raz, can you pick up your microphone maybe a little bit? Do you have a microphone on or?
No, I can try and speak. I can maybe. Do you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, so I just let me raise the volume. Okay, do you hear me?
I'm being told that you might have a microphone on your earpiece. Is there a microphone on the cord there on the cable?
No, there isn't. There isn't. I did it yesterday and the day before. It was okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you great now. Yeah, just sometimes
Okay,
it kind of dips out. But
I'll just speak
okay.
louder.
Thank you.
Okay. There is, of course, an overlap between the Arab community and the poor community because, as you mentioned, the percentage of poor people in the Arab community is much larger than the overall community. But I think that their situation is not only the economic situation, it's also due to their being a minority. And in this sense, I think that there is an overlap between their situation and other disadvantaged community around the world. So I will be speaking about this point later on. What is important for me also to say is that I think in the context of this panel, that in order to improve the situation, we probably will be talking about financial, legal, and other procedures. But I think for me, it's also a theme of consciousness and consciousness transformation. Because as I see, um, around the world now, and in Israel also, not in every place, but of course in many places, nationalism is raising its hand. Due to this, the, uh, uh, the state ability and willingness to take into consideration disadvantaged community, which is foreign communities, is lessening more and more. So what we should think about is also not how to change the situation, the practical steps, but also how to change the situation by changing people consciousness about what is being human, sorry, what is being of different culture, and what should be the relations in between local cultures and ethnical group and other cultures. This is why I think multiculturalism is relevant to the subject, and multicultural education should be taking a further step in order to advance the disadvantaged communities. So I'll be questioning this later on according to your questions. One more thing that is important to say that in Israel, one of the problems is that in the education system, there is only one narrative which is allowed to be said. And this narrative is the Jewish Zionist narrative. And because the Arab or the Palestinian citizen of Israel narrative is not allowed to be said, there is never a real opportunity, neither for this community nor for the Jewish community, to reconcile with the past and move forward. And one more last thing, in Israel, there is a segregated education system. Arab and Jews, they are studying not together, they're studying alone. So they don't have the chance to meet each other, to speak with each other, to hear other cultures, narrative, opinions, and basically to see that everybody is human. So this is also I see as a main problem. So this is for now.
Well, I think those are all very good points. I particularly like the point that about the overlap because I think, for example, in Israel, as you mentioned, there may be a particular overlap between the poor community and the Arab community. You know, you find that in a lot of countries that particular groups, that the vulnerable do typically fall into the poor category usually. And also the idea of foreign students in general, or foreign communities in general, you know, that certainly applies to refugees and displaced persons, because you know, you find then in the case of refugees, certainly, that they have crossed an international border. They're living in some other country away from their own country. They are the foreigner in their host community. And I think those are particular challenges, as you said, multiculturalism. I mean, there's linguistic hurdles to get past, but there's also the cultural hurdles to get past. So in my work previously, working with refugees in resettlement, we've found that some people coming from certain cultures, I'm thinking particularly of some people that I knew from Afghanistan who brought with them a cultural idea that it wasn't important for their daughters to get an education. It was important for their sons too, but not necessarily for their daughters. So even living in the United States, where they had equal access to education, both the boys and the girls, the parents had a cultural view that was disadvantaging the daughters in certain cases. I'm not talking about all people, but I certainly witnessed that in some cases. And so I think the point that you raised about multiculturalism is really important. It's certainly something that is, I think, a particularly big, if it may be intangible hurdle for people to get over, right? It's not, you know, it's one thing to have access to a building and to have access to a teacher and to have access to books. It's another thing altogether to be able to cross these cultural, sociological barriers to be able to provide education. And I want to ask you, about that in just a minute, but I wanted to ask Dexter to chime in here if he could. Dexter, you mentioned about social and emotional learning.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because in some ways we're talking about the social aspect of learning, the social side of that social emotional learning.
Yes.
Is, you know, we're talking about vulnerable groups that in some cases their society may have collapsed, right? Or they have been removed from their native society and moved into a host society.
Yes.
Or in cases like maybe in Israel or in other places that maybe a certain subset of the population, this vulnerable group, is not being cared for by society. So the societal aspect of it seems, for a lot of the vulnerable communities, is lacking. The societal system is not there.
Yes.
I wonder if you could speak to that in the context of social and emotional learning. How do you provide social learning when the child may not know what their society is?
Yep, very basic but really important question. I guess the basic idea in social and emotional learning is that all learning is social and emotional. Of course, it's also academic or cognitive and physical as well, but that it's not separate, but that basically learning happens within a social context or social contexts, and you know, interpersonal, family context, the small community context, the overall cultural or national context. But that's one key thing, is that I think that's the kind of the recent idea, the recent solidification of this idea is that we've recognized sort of emotional intelligence and social development as being important in the past for a long time, but it's been considered as kind of separate. And maybe it's catching up a little bit with Vygotsky's idea about cognitive development or development in general, is that we start learning language, social language. That's Vygotsky's idea, not so yeah, language as a baby, as a kid, first social, and then it becomes kind of egocentric, and then becomes more like inner speech, and that leads to the cognitive and rational kind of development skills. So social and emotional, I think, is seen as being basic, really, really basic on an individual level. and trying to put that in terms of, I think, um, vulnerable communities. When both of you were talking about these different communities, refugees, or in Israel, the multicultural communities, I was thinking about Australia, which, like Israel, is really a very, very multicultural society. But often what's kind of not considered in this multicultural context are the original inhabitants, the Aboriginal people who, peoples, over 200 of them, who, so Australia was originally very, very multicultural. And they have kind of been displaced. They've lost their connection with their land. They've lost their language, some of them have lost their language. So, you know, I think the idea of assimilation in Australia is, in the past, has been kind of separating or making everybody participate in the same social context or the same society. Whereas I think it has to be recognized the different levels of society, the community level, the family level, the local community level, the big wider community level. And so the importance of local control of education. Education schools and stuff having their own, maybe using the local languages, the native languages, the ways of teaching. So that's my kind of response. I'm not sure if it's a really good answer to your question, but that social and emotional learning is very basic, and it has to be kind of on the individual person and context and situation level, or levels.
I think it's a very good answer. Thank you. I mean, particularly for me and maybe for others who are not as involved in the educational side, certainly not the educational psychology side of things. I was particularly interested when you were talking about you know, that things like language and that, well, all learning in general, but language in particular is a social process, you know. Yes. And I think that ties in interestingly, perhaps, with what Raz was talking about the importance of multiculturalism in education and being able to educate across cultural divides. And Raz, I wonder if maybe you could speak to that a little bit, like this idea. I'm curious, is there, you know, in trying to level the playing field, in trying to make sure that all of the kids are receiving the same level, the same quality of education, and across cultures, to bring cultures together, is there the risk, or how do you avoid the loss of a culture or the loss of a language, as Dexter was talking about, has happened to so many indigenous people? You know, for example, the Arabic-speaking community, if they're the disenfranchised, if they're the disadvantaged in Israel, then how do you educate them alongside Hebrew-speaking students without risking the loss of their culture and their language?
Do you hear me now?
I can, yes.
Okay. I've been thinking a lot about this lately. I'll tell you a little story. It's short. You mentioned that I'm also a pedagogical instructor, so I go to see my students teaching at schools. So I went to see one student of mine in Ramle, which is a mixed city of Arab and Jews who live together. And well, they don't actually live together. They live in different neighborhoods, you know, still, because even in the mixed cities, the communities usually live together. This I see is a part of the problem. So I spoke with this teacher in the Arab school, and I told him about my children going to a bilingual school, bicultural school, learning together the cultures of others, learning to respect, but still to also develop their own identity and their own culture. And this guy told me, I don't think it's okay. I don't think it's right. I think Arab and Jewish people should study separately, because we are the Arabs, the Muslims, usually, not all Arabs, but Muslims. We have a different attitude towards religion. Our language is different. Our habits are different. So I think people, Jewish people and Arab people should study separately. And I was quite puzzled by his answer and his position. So I think there are two ways to tackle this problem. One is really to separate the education, you know, to take one culture, for example, the Arab culture or the Arab Muslim culture, and let them to have an autonomy. And this is a discussion which is going on in Israel. Let them have at least partial autonomy about deciding both about the content and form of learning. And by this, let them keep and develop their own culture. Myself, I'm not a fan of this attitude because, as I said before, I think that when people do not meet, when people do not see each other, when people do not actually live together, the human tendency towards fear and hatred of the other is overtaking other tendencies. So for me, the solution is not to separate schools and educational institutions, but rather encourage combining communities, cultures, both in the public sphere, cities, villages, or whatever, and in schools. As I see it in the community I'm a part of, when you sit together, when you learn together, you really get to know the other, your fears, your prejudice, your tendency, as I said, toward remoteness from the other is disappearing. At the same time, there is no problem with this to keep and even to develop the same culture. Both sides or more than two sides are coming from. So for me, the real solution is to bring people together, both in the educational and in the public sphere.
I think that's very interesting because, you know, there's the argument to be made that I mean, culture is a constantly evolving thing, right? It's a very fluid, amorphous kind of a concept, right? Like it's very easy for us to talk in concrete terms about what is you know, what is French culture, or what is Hebrew culture, what is Japanese culture, but you know, the culture here in Japan is different than it was 50 years ago or 10 years ago. You know, it's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving for all of us. You know, I grew up in the United States, and you know, there's an old joke my European friends used to say, what's the difference between the United States and a glass of milk? If you leave a glass of milk out for 200 years, it will develop a culture. Of course, we do have a culture, though. It's just uniquely ours, right? And it's you know, it has positives and negatives like any other culture, but it's very much influenced by all of the cultures that have come there and have lived. Some have maybe some have managed to get along more harmoniously than others, but all of that has mixed to form a new culture. And you know, again, I know in the United States we talk a lot about generational issues as well, you know, from the boomers to the Gen Xers to the millennials and all this, but that's because people would argue that my culture is different than my parents, even though we're Americans, right? So culture is this big fluid thing, and I like the way that Raz put it, that maybe by combining cultures, we're not asking an incoming group to forfeit their culture, to forfeit their language, or to forfeit their habits or their religions or anything else. We can learn from each other, and you know, I can practice my religion and you can practice yours, and you know, but we can still go to school together and work together and all these other things. So I think that's a good I think that's a good approach for a lot of the multicultural questions that we're.
If I may say, Brian, if I may say, I really think that one of the hazards in applying multiculturalism is exactly this. take one community, one culture, and you only let it develop by its own, it's developed as against the other. And this is what is going on in many places around the world. When you combine, you know, a certain how would I put it, a certain amount of cosmopolitanism into multiculturalism, advancing all of the ideas of humanity, of human shared qualities, and you let the people be together. So you tackle this problem of isolation and of the human tendency to see the other as and to develop their own identity on the expense of the other identity. So I really think it's important. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good point. The us versus them mentality, and it usually boils down to, in that context, as far as culture is concerned, that I define my culture by not being a part of yours, or I define your culture as being not a part of mine. Dexter, maybe you could talk a little bit again, especially from perhaps the educational side and the psychological side. The importance of that. I'm curious about in younger students, especially because older students might have, on the one hand, more kind of set ideas about what is their culture or what is their opinions and their practices and everything. But on the other hand, they might be more able to reason and rationalize those kinds of discussions. What about in young learners? What kind of impact does culture have on them? Do they have a sense of, at a young age, do people have a sense of belonging or not belonging, or us versus them, or cultural differences? Or I'm curious about your take on that.
Yeah, it's again another really difficult question to answer. So I guess I'll just answer based on what I was thinking while you were talking, based on my son's experience. He's 14 now, and in the last, especially elementary school, what kind of opened my eyes to the role of elementary school in Japan. And I think socialization is basically it. And it involves everything they do, it's cleaning the schools together, which is a kind of a unique Japanese type practice. Doing everything together, the sports events, it's very much a together thing. So for me, that's learning the culture. Maybe not specific. There are specific practices, but they're learning how to apply that sense of the group is more important than the individual, or the group is stronger and you benefit more in a positive way, not the group against you, but that you're going to benefit much more from being part of a group. And that's a core part of Japanese culture, I think. The pressures that come from that, the sort of pressure to conform, and to, if you're different, how that, the bullying that comes in because of that. So for me, especially the young age, the elementary school is where socialization to Japanese cultural codes, maybe. So, the basic part of a lot of Japanese work culture, or the different groups, the hierarchy within the culture, senpai, kohai. I think all of that comes in the sort of elementary school practices. The kind of the like I said, the undokai, the sports events, the cleaning of the schools, the playground kind of dynamics, or and the teacher, how the teacher deals within the classroom as well. I think that instills a sense of this is how groups work, and how these sort of practices will be applied in many different kind of specifically Japanese ceremonies or social practices. So that's your question, Brad?
Yeah, it does. Actually, I think it's a very interesting. I'm glad that you brought up the Japanese elementary schools because and Raz, I'd like to hear your take on this. So for those in the audience who aren't as familiar with the particularly early childhood education in Japan, elementary schools in Japan, for example, typically would not have any kind of janitorial or custodial staff. The students would be responsible for cleaning the school. And there's one period in the day in which the whole school, all the students and the teachers and everybody, they all clean together. And that's how the school gets cleaned every day. Similarly, they serve each other lunch. So, you know, if it's your week to serve, you put on the white coat and the hairnet and you serve your classmates lunch. I have long been of the opinion that this is, both of these are really fantastic and important practices because, as Dexter said, they do teach that the group is more important than the individual. You know, that we're all in this together, kind of a thing. But I've always felt like there's a strong kind of egalitarian undercurrent to this. That it doesn't matter your family or your position, your family's position in the community. If your father's the richest man in town or the poorest, it doesn't matter. When it's your turn to clean the toilets, you clean the toilets. When it's your turn to serve lunch to your classmates, you serve lunch. And likewise, then you are served by them. I think my impression has always been, and I've been in Japan some 15 years now, has been that that carries over into adult life. As Dexter said, that's where they really learn this culture. And as opposed to in the United States where I live, where certain professions might be looked down on or certain people might be looked down on, you don't get that nearly as much in Japan because everyone respects that everyone else has a role to play. And, you know, as long as they're doing it, as long as they're doing their job and their role, you know, honorably, then they deserve our respect. And yep. There's a lot that I like about that. I won't go into the downsides of that. There, you know, there are certainly problems with bullying. There are problems with the senior-junior relationships and things like that. It's I'm not here to say that this is the perfect answer, but as Raz was talking about this multiculturalism and how we kind of combine communities without losing one or the other, ideas like this seem to me to maybe hold, they may have the advantage or the benefit of putting young people, whether they're, you know, from a disenfranchised community or a refugee community or again, we haven't really talked about special needs students and things like that, but putting all of these people into a situation where they're all in it together, right? Not just learning in the classroom, but cleaning the schools or serving each other lunch and those kinds of things. Raz, do you think there's any benefit in that? There's any potential in that to help bring communities together, especially when you're talking about school students?
I'll address this question a bit differently, okay, with your permission.
Of course.
Because I'm thinking, because what I think is we can learn from this is that when we look at other communities, other cultures, when we really look into them, we see that in each culture there are things we can learn from. We see that our culture, for example, what I think like both of you, I think it's wonderful. And I think if you teach this kind of thing, you say, even to kids in Israel, you know, you say, let's look a bit into Japanese culture and see what they do, okay? So you start to know other cultures, you start to be more open. When you start to be, this is what I'm talking about in the beginning by saying consciousness transformation, you know? Because we are so, and in Israel, you see it, unfortunately, I think it's true for both the Arab and Jewish communities and culture. Sometimes we are so absorbed in our cultures, so we do not see other cultures. We see other cultures, as you said, as against us. And naturally, as for example, you know, I told you I'm doing critical thinking. Richard Paul talked about it when he talked about the dialogical thinking. You learn to know the other side, the other people point of view. You get a bit out of your egocentric and sociocentric point of view. Sorry. So this is why it's so important, even in a one-side community cultures, you know, to learn other cultures, to get open to other cultures, to see there are different point of view about the world, to see that your culture is by no means the only or the upper culture. You can take and give, as you said, there are good and bad in each cultures. So I see that this is what we should be striving for. We should be striving to open our students, and of course the government and states attitude toward other cultures and communities as a result of understanding that there is no one super culture. There is no one culture that is better than the other. And you can give and take from each culture. And this is what I think is really a multicultural education and multicultural perspective. And this is a very difficult thing to do. This is a challenge. This is a challenge. As I said before, as you see the trends toward today in the world, we're talking here, you know, but if we look in the world, we see so many countries just shelling into themselves, the States or England now, Britain, Hungary, Israel in many senses. So this is a big challenge to get your nose out of your culture and to see the other and learn from it.
I agree entirely, and on all counts, actually. I think that we seem to all be in agreement that teaching other cultures, even if it's not, you know, if you have a room that's mixed between Hebrew-speaking and Arabic-speaking students, for example, it's not just teaching about each other's cultures, it's teaching about different cultures in general. Yes. Making sure that young people are learning about other cultures, learning about other parts of the world, other cultures or subcultures within their own communities, within their own countries, and just being educated on them in and of itself helps them to realize that the other is not some inhuman, monstrous thing. They're just slightly different than you. You know, my Muslim friends tend to go to the mosque on Fridays, and my Jewish friends tend to go to the synagogue on Saturdays, and my Christian friends tend to go to church on Sundays. But there's, at the base of it, nothing particularly different from, you know, between them. And so I think, yeah, teaching other cultures, teaching about difference and the benefits and the beauty of difference and diversity. And maybe as well teaching about community and togetherness through action, like serving each other meals. Maybe all of those kinds of initiatives together can help us to make sure that foreigners or refugees or disadvantaged communities are not being left behind, are not being ostracized, and are not being neglected, particularly when it comes to education, which we all know is of the utmost importance for our young people. I think we're running near the end of time, but I would like to give you each, if you'd like to say something to kind of wrap it up, and then we'll have a couple of minutes for questions after that. Dexter, why don't I go to you first, and then we'll let Raz have the last word before we take questions.
Okay. Well, I think one idea that came to mind just when Raz was talking about you know, learning other cultures and stuff. Actually, it's a kind of teaching approach called Jigsaw Learning, and it was developed, I think, in the States during the kind of integration education, integrating black and white kids into schools, and a couple of psychologists in the local area were kind of try to work out what to do if you have, when you have the situation of, okay, previously you had schools for black kids, schools for white kids. Now you're putting them together. They're going to be in the same class, but they're going to be separate. You're going to be the group of black and the group of white, and the power relations within that, like, depending on the teachers. And so this technique or approach was directly related to that. The two guys developed this approach where you have kind of stages of learning. So it's a kind of cooperative learning, but you develop this way to have each person be recognized for what they know and what they can offer, what they can contribute. So the first stage in some groups, it's a kind of a jigsaw. So they have this understanding of this one thing, or maybe 5 different things. Each group will have like reading or knowledge about those 5 things. And then they swap groups so that in each group, there's one expert from each of those. So everybody gets a chance to be an expert, to share, contribute what others don't know. And so to be seen as being an expert, to be contributing on an equal level. I think that kind of sharing is necessary, because you could put together, and when it's the power relationships, it really, no change happens. I guess the other kind of a theory about change that needs to be kind of a part of this approach, some kind of way that in different situations, with different communities, with different ideologies, some kind of idea about how what's important for things to change. I think there are different kind of theories of change, but it must involve, the people, the context, the process, and time, I guess. But something like that jigsaw approach.
Oh, very good. I like that. Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to study up on jigsaw learning. It sounds really interesting. So Raz, would you like to add something?
I can say about what Dexter said. I teach in the college. Basically, half Arabs and half Jews, but and we teach in mixed classes, but always on the class they sit the Arabs here and the Jews here. And if I don't mix them in some missions, they will continue to sit separately. So it's my job to do it, during the educational process. What I want to say in general, that I think in a way multiculturalism is one answer to how, of course, only one aspect of the answer to the education of disadvantaged or vulnerable communities. But we should notice that we should add to this multicultural attitude 2 aspects, which otherwise might be in danger. First is what I mentioned before under the name of cosmopolitanism or other universalism, if you want. We need also to advance the ideas of humanity as a whole, of being human, of the shared qualities and abilities that we have as humans, and not only to separate qualities we have as cultures. And the other one is not to forget also to develop individuality. Because what I see in the process of overemphasizing political or cultural identities is the loss of individual thinking. So if we combine together multiculturalism with a flavor of cosmopolitanism and at the same time not forgetting the importance of the individual inside the community, inside the culture, so we might be heading in the right direction.
No, that's very good. I appreciate that, and from both of you, I think that's a good kind of summary of what we're talking about here. That these things, it is just one part of it. It's not, we certainly haven't answered every aspect of this in the time that we have, but I think I feel like I have some ideas that I can take forward and implement in my own classrooms to help ensure that students are learning to work together, they're learning to feel a sense of belonging in that community, that they're learning about other cultures and respect for other cultures and diversity, and that they're, you know, as in the Jigsaw example that Dexter gave us, that everybody gets to be seen as an expert. You know, I think that's particularly important in vulnerable communities. I was talking to some Black friends of mine in America who said that one of the big difficulties growing up Black in America was that they didn't see role models who looked like them. They often didn't see teachers of color and things like that. And so whether it's women or people of color or foreigners or, you know, people from whatever community they came from, giving some sort of a role model that looks like the students that you're trying to help, I think is really important. And it sounds to me like this Jigsaw learning has that potential that, you know, everybody in the classroom has an opportunity to be an expert, and hopefully gives students then the sense that everybody can be an expert, everybody can bring a different strength, and even those who look like me or different than me or whatever the case may be. I've talked far too long. We did have a question that I just wanted to throw out one real quick, and we may have kind of answered this, but Gregorio asks, how can we capitalize on diversity in the classroom to promote learning? So I'll kind of summarize what some of the things that you guys had said, which was, you know, again, making sure that we recognize everyone's expertise in different areas, teaching about our cultures and the other cultures represented in our classrooms, and also teaching about cultures outside of our classroom or outside of our community. That, I think those are ways that we capitalize on diversity. And Dexter or Raz, do you have something you want to add to that? How do you capitalize on diversity?
Yeah, I think you just said it. I think techniques are good, like the Jigsaw learning and ideas. I think it's individual teachers as well as maybe the whole school, like the team of teachers needs to have it as a goal, capitalizing on the diversity. And perhaps to capitalize on it, first of all, it needs to be recognized. Like, you know, what are the ways in which students are diverse, you know, the different ways, recognized and then understood really deeply, like, you know, not just a superficial idea of their diversity, like the food or stuff, but kind of understanding it, and maybe trying to label it, so trying to put some language onto it, so that ways that the students themselves can communicate about, you know, the diversity, students can understand it deeply, and yeah, and then express it and communicate about it.
Very good. Okay, Raz, any last thoughts?
Just could continue what Dexter said, and before, the importance of the social and emotional aspects of education and learning. I think that, and in response to this question, I think it's important not to stay all the time at the abstract general level, but to let students to bring their own individual and cultural stories into the classroom. You know, not just talking about other stories, the general stories. Tell me your story, you know, tell me, where are you coming from? What are your experiences? Tell me about yourself. Not living all the time on the abstract level, because we are real humans and we are coming with real experiences. And if you let this to come inside the class, so understanding is a change from all sides. So I think this is important.
Very good. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I could honestly, I could talk about this with you guys for hours. There's so much more to say, so much more to cover, and hopefully we'll all continue to work on this in our own fields, and hopefully maybe we can collaborate on some more work in this area in the future.